The Arizona desert stretched endlessly under a molten sky, where the wind carried whispers of old wars, lost loves, and dying legends. Among the scattered cacti and the sun-baked mesas rode a man whose name once echoed through every saloon and outlaw camp west of the Pecos. Elias Kane, the last of the great trail riders. His beard had turned silver, his eyes still sharp as a hawk's, and though his bones ached with age, his spirit remained unbroken. Elias had spent his life driving cattle, fighting rustlers, and outrunning bounty hunters who mistook his sense of justice for lawlessness. Now, in the twilight of his years, he rode not for gold or fame, but for something far more elusive: peace. He had lost count of how many towns he'd left behind, how many graves he'd dug for those who'd crossed him, and how many nights he'd spent alone, beneath the desert moon, haunted by memories of the woman he once loved and the war that had taken her away. One evening, as the crimson sun dipped behind the jagged cliffs, Elias spotted smoke rising in the distance. Thin, pale, and steady. An Apache signal fire. He knew the signs well. He had once fought them, then later traded with them, and in his final years, he had come to respect them. But this smoke carried urgency. Not war, but distress. He followed the trail up through the canyons, until he came upon the remains of an Apache caravan ambushed by raiders. Wagons burned, horses lay still, and the air reeked of gunpowder and blood. But among the wreckage, one survivor stirred. A young Apache woman, wounded but alive. She was fierce even in her pain, trying to lift her knife as Elias approached. Her arm trembled, her breath ragged, and her face, painted with the marks of her tribe, was streaked with dust and tears. Elias dismounted, his shadow long against the dying firelight, and knelt beside her. Though no words passed between them, the moment was charged. An old cowboy, scarred by life, and a proud woman, still defiant in the face of death. Gently, he tore a strip from his shirt and bound her wound. He carried her to his horse, whispering softly to calm the animal, and rode toward a hidden canyon spring he knew well. A place only the old trail riders remembered. That night, as the stars spread across the velvet sky, Elias built a fire, laid her near the warmth, and tended her wounds with care. Her breathing steadied, and he could see the strength returning to her eyes. She was no ordinary woman. Her bearing spoke of leadership, her spirit of fire. Over the following days, she recovered slowly. She would watch him from a distance, puzzled by the contradiction before her. A man who looked half dead yet moved with the skill and confidence of a warrior. She had seen many men before, white and native alike, but none carried such quiet command. He hunted with precision, mended his gear with patience, and treated her not as a burden, but as an equal. When she finally could stand, she performed a silent gesture of respect, placing her hand over her heart and bowing slightly. In her eyes was gratitude, but also something more. Curiosity. She had been raised among warriors, and she recognized greatness even in age. As days passed, they traveled together toward her tribe's territory. Along the journey, she learned who he was, the once feared gunman who had vanished from history. Tales of Elias Kane had reached even Apache camps. Stories of the cowboy who faced entire gangs alone, the man who refused to kill unless he had no choice, the one whose sense of honor made him a legend. She began to see beyond the silver hair and worn hands, to the raw strength beneath, when he lifted fallen logs or scaled cliffs to scout. She found herself studying him, realizing that though time had marked him, it had not conquered him. By the time they neared the Apache borderlands, something had changed in her gaze. It was no longer suspicion or gratitude. It was admiration. She had seen men of her own tribe in their prime, who could not match his skill or endurance. When they reached her people's land, the tribal scouts appeared, bows drawn, ready to strike, but she raised her hand, stopping them. In a voice clear and commanding, she declared who he was and what he had done. The warriors lowered their weapons, uncertain. No white man had ever been spoken for in such a way. Elias prepared to leave quietly after ensuring her safety, but as he turned his horse, she stepped forward, her expression unreadable. Her voice trembled with the weight of realization and admiration beyond words. She looked at him, the weathered face, the steady hands, the living proof of endurance and strength, and thought of the generations her people would lose if such a man's spirit vanished without a trace. In that moment, she whispered to her elders, her voice filled with wonder and conviction. "Such a capable old cowboy," she said softly, "deserves to pass on his genes." Her words rippled through the camp like wind through the canyon. Elders murmured. Warriors glanced at the old man with new respect. Elias stood silent, unaware of what she had said, but sensing that his story, long thought to be nearing its end, was only just beginning again. The fire crackled, and in its light, two worlds, one fading, one enduring, stood face to face. The old cowboy had saved her life, but soon, she would change his. The night after their arrival in the Apache village was heavy with silence. The firelight flickered across the faces of the tribe, reflecting curiosity, disbelief, and a strange sense of reverence. Elias Kane sat apart from them, sharpening his knife by the fire, his movements calm and unhurried. Around him, men of younger strength and sharper eyes watched, not out of hostility, but intrigue. The Apache woman he had saved, Niley, stood before her elders, her voice steady and commanding. Though Elias could not understand her words, the tone told him enough. She was speaking for him, defending his presence in their sacred land, recounting how he had pulled her from the jaws of death when the desert itself had turned against her. The elders listened, their weathered faces unreadable. Among the Apaches, age was not a weakness. It was proof of survival. And though Elias was an outsider, his endurance mirrored their own code: to live through pain, to honor strength, to respect those who defy time. The old cowboy kept his eyes low, never meeting theirs, knowing the customs well. The desert taught humility, and he had long ago learned that pride could kill faster than a bullet. After some time, Niley approached him, her expression softer now. She gestured toward the elders, and though words failed them, he understood that they would let him stay for the night. It was a gesture of acceptance, rare and earned. As the night deepened, Elias sat beneath the open sky, staring at the constellations that had guided him through countless trails. He thought of the past, of gunfights, betrayals, and fleeting moments of tenderness. He had once loved a woman, long ago, the daughter of a rancher who never returned his love, after she learned the truth of his outlaw years. Her memory was a ghost that rode with him still. Now, as he looked across the fire at Niley speaking with her tribe, he saw something in her eyes that stirred memories best left buried, not love, but recognition. She saw him not as an intruder, but as a living echo of the old ways, of courage that time could not erase. In the days that followed, Elias helped where he could. He repaired saddles, mended spears, and hunted game in the ravines. The younger men watched with silent awe as he tracked deer with uncanny precision, his instincts sharper than theirs despite his years. He carried himself with quiet dignity, never boasting, never faltering. Niley, meanwhile, began to hear murmurs among her people. The elders spoke of balance, how the spirits rewarded those who preserved strength in their lineage. Some whispered that perhaps this man, though white, had the spirit of the desert within him. Elias noticed their glances but paid them no mind. He had seen admiration turn to fear before, and fear to hate. He intended to leave soon, before gratitude turned into gossip. But the desert had its own plans. On the fourth night, a rider arrived from the north, a scout from a rival Apache band. His horse was foaming, his voice urgent. They were being hunted, not by outlaws, but by a band of mercenaries hired by railroad men who wanted the land cleared for expansion. The Apache had fought them before, but this time the attackers had numbers and modern rifles. The council gathered swiftly. Niley's tribe was small, and the nearest allies were days away. Their warriors were brave but few. Defeat seemed certain. Elias listened quietly from the shadows until one of the elders beckoned him forward. Nayeli translated their question. Would he fight alongside them? He didn't hesitate. He had fought his own battles against greed. Men who thought land and gold meant more than lives. Though his hands had grown old, they still knew the weight of a rifle, the rhythm of battle. For Elias Kane, this was not just another fight. It was a chance to end his story the way it began. Standing his ground, protecting the innocent, and facing the storm head-on. The next morning, the desert woke to the sound of preparation. Spears were sharpened, horses saddled, and traps laid along the narrow canyon pass. Elias inspected their defenses, improving them with his experience, positioning archers higher, concealing gunmen among the rocks, and spreading dry brush to use for smoke screens. Nayeli watched him work with a mix of respect and wonder. She saw how the younger men followed his orders without question. Despite his age, Elias commanded the battlefield like a general born of dust and thunder. When the mercenaries came, their rifles gleamed under the sun. They rode with confidence, laughing, unaware that death waited in the cliffs. At Elias's signal, a hawk's cry echoing across the gorge, the desert erupted. Arrows flew, rocks tumbled, and gunfire shattered the morning calm. The ambush was perfect. Elias moved through the chaos like a ghost, his rifle cracking with deadly precision. Every shot counted. Every motion was deliberate. By midday, the mercenaries lay scattered across the sand, their arrogance buried with them. The tribe had suffered losses, but they had won. Nayeli's people cheered, but their eyes turned most often toward the old cowboy. The man who had fought as if death itself still feared him. That night, the victory fires burned high. The tribe celebrated their survival, and for the first time in decades, Elias smiled without the weight of guilt. He had given something back to the land that had taken so much from him. But deep within the firelight, another conversation was unfolding. One he could not hear. Nayeli and the elders spoke again. They spoke of strength, of legacy, of what it meant to preserve greatness when the world was changing too fast. They spoke of Elias Kane, not as a stranger, but as a gift the spirits had sent. And then, in a voice both humble and awed, Nayeli repeated her words from before. Such a capable old cowboy, she said, deserves to pass on his genes. The elders nodded, some solemnly, others with faint smiles. Among the Apache, bloodlines were sacred, not of color, but of courage. And in Elias, they saw both. The fire burned low as the desert wind whispered through the camp, carrying with it a sense of destiny. The old cowboy slept that night under the same stars that had guided him all his life, unaware that his story, far from ending, was now about to change forever. The dawn broke slow and golden over the Apache camp, painting the canyon walls in hues of amber and fire. Smoke from the victory fires still lingered, and the scent of sage mixed with gunpowder drifted on the wind. Elias Kane awoke before the others, as he always did, his instincts forged from years of sleeping under uncertain skies. He sat beside the dying embers, sipping from his canteen, his eyes distant but alert. Around him, the camp began to stir. Women gathering water, men tending to wounded warriors, children running with laughter through the dust. The battle had been won, but its echoes still haunted the valley. And in those echoes, the old cowboy found an uneasy peace. For the first time in years, Elias felt something he had long thought impossible: belonging. These people, who once would have seen him as an enemy, now looked to him as a guardian, perhaps even a symbol. The respect in their eyes was wordless but unmistakable. He had blood beside them, and that was a language older than any treaty. Nayeli, the young Apache woman whose life he had saved, moved with quiet confidence through the camp. Her injuries had healed, but the encounter had left a deeper mark. Not of fear, but of revelation. She had seen courage beyond youth, strength beyond muscle, and spirit beyond age. The night before, her words to the elders had spread like wildfire. Such a capable old cowboy deserves to pass on his genes. It had not been meant as a jest, nor even as a provocation, but as truth. Among her people, strength, true strength, was sacred, and Elias Kane had proven that his body and soul still carried the unyielding power of survival, the kind that only time could test. Now, as she approached him by the morning fire, the camp watched quietly. There was no need for words between them, the air carried meaning enough. She offered him a small carved talisman, a hawk etched into bone, the Apache symbol of vigilance and endurance. He took it with quiet gratitude, his weathered fingers brushing hers only briefly. But the touch lingered in her thoughts long after. The elders met that day beneath the shade of the canyon cliffs. They discussed the future, their land, their bloodlines, and the strange twist of fate that had brought this man into their midst. To them, Elias was not merely a wanderer or a savior. He was living proof that nature's will was stronger than man's prejudice. In the Apache way, legacy was not just through children, but through spirit, passing on the essence of one's power, courage, and wisdom to the next generation. The idea was not of romance, but of respect, of ensuring that the desert's strength never died. When Elias was called before the council, he stood tall but silent, uncertain of what was being decided. He did not understand their language fully, but he could feel the weight of their stares, the quiet reverence in their tone. Naili stood beside them, her eyes fixed on him, filled with resolve. The elder, gray-haired and solemn, spoke with the rhythm of the wind, his voice deep and ceremonial. The others nodded. Naili stepped forward and placed her hand over her heart, then over his, the gesture of offering, of continuity. It took Elias several moments to grasp the meaning behind the ritual. He had seen similar ceremonies before, when two warriors' fates became bound by honor, but this was different. This was the tribe's way of saying he had become part of them. Not as a guest, but as legacy. He didn't know whether to laugh or refuse, but something in Naili's gaze stopped him. It wasn't pity, nor infatuation, but destiny, a force older than either of them. She was offering him something rare, a chance to leave behind more than just stories whispered in saloons or carved into headstones. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the wind turned cold, the ceremony took place. It was simple, no grandeur, no vows, only fire, earth, and the watchful eyes of the tribe. Elias felt out of place, an outsider being woven into the fabric of a people who had every reason to despise his kind. Yet, in that moment, he also felt the burden of his loneliness lift, replaced by something strange and solemn: acceptance. Naili stood beside him, her presence fierce and serene. Around them, the women sang the song of renewal, the song sung when warriors passed their strength into the generations to come. The men stood in silence, acknowledging him not as an intruder, but as one of their own. That night, when the stars blanketed the canyon, Elias sat by the fire long after the others had gone to sleep. The hawk talisman hung from his neck, warm from his skin. He thought of the life he had lived, the battles fought, the roads ridden, the regrets carried. And now, somehow, in this place far from the world he once knew, his story was being rewritten. The Apache did not see him as old. They saw him as proven. The wrinkles on his face, the scars on his hands, they were not signs of decay but of survival. To them, he was not a man nearing his end, but a vessel of wisdom that the desert itself had shaped. Naili, from her tent, watched the faint glow of his fire and knew that the spirits had chosen well. Her people believed in omens. And this man, this worn but unbroken cowboy, was a sign that life could begin even when the world thought it had ended. Days turned into weeks. Elias began teaching the younger men how to track by moonlight, how to shoot straight without wasting a bullet, how to read the wind for danger. His lessons were simple, but profound, born from a life that had seen every face of betrayal and every edge of survival. And in turn, he learned their ways. The Apache codes of honor, the silent language of respect, the rituals of fire and stone. He found a peace he had never known among his own kind, but deep down, beneath that calm, he also felt the pull of something new. A bond not born of duty, but of destiny. The tribe had accepted him. The woman he had saved had chosen him. And for the first time, Elias Kane began to understand that maybe his story was never meant to end alone on some forgotten trail. Yet far beyond the canyon, trouble was stirring again. Men who sought vengeance for the mercenaries slain in the gorge. They rode under the flag of greed and retribution, bringing with them the same violence Elias thought he had left behind. The desert was about to test him once more, not as a wanderer, but as a protector of the people who had become his own. The wind over the desert carried a strange stillness, the kind that came before storms, before war, before fate itself took a deep breath. The Apache camp had settled into quiet life again, its fires burning steady beneath the watchful cliffs. But in the far distance, beyond the mesas, dust began to rise. It was the mark of riders, men coming fast, and not with peace in their hearts. Elias Kane sensed it before anyone spoke. Years of surviving the frontier had sharpened instincts that no amount of age could dull. He felt the air shift, the silence deepen, the horses grow restless. Something was coming. In the weeks since the battle, Elias had become a part of the tribe's rhythm. The young warriors called him Old Hawk, after the talisman that hung from his neck. He taught them to fight not with rage, but with patience. To strike only when the desert itself stood with them. To read the land as they would read a man's soul. He had found a strange peace among them. A peace he had never earned in the world beyond the canyon. Nayeli often watched him from afar, seeing how even the children now ran to him, their laughter chasing away the last ghosts of suspicion. The man who once wandered alone now belonged somewhere, and for the first time, he seemed content. But fate, it seemed, had not finished writing his story. A scout arrived at dusk, his horse lathered, his face streaked with fear. He carried grim news. A large band of armed riders was approaching from the north. White men, rough men, the same company Elias had seen branded on the stolen rifles of the mercenaries they had fought before. The railroad men had not forgotten. They were coming for revenge, and this time, they brought numbers and firepower. The Apache council gathered immediately. Their faces were grave, their words few. They could run, abandon the canyon and hide among the high ridges. But doing so would mean surrendering their ancestral land, their home. It would mean erasing themselves from the desert that had birthed them. Elias stood silently at the edge of the council fire, listening. He knew what had to be done before anyone said it aloud. He had lived this kind of story too many times. Evil did not rest, it simply changed its mask. That night, while the tribe prepared for evacuation, Elias rode alone into the dark canyons. The moon guided him, the stars his only witness. He rode not for glory or death, but to buy them time. The plan was simple, the way all desperate plans are: delay the enemy, turn their attention toward him, and give the tribe a chance to disappear into the wilderness. He reached a ridge overlooking the valley by dawn. From there, he saw them. More than 40 riders, rifles glinting, dust trailing behind like the tail of a comet. They moved with purpose, confident, cruel. Elias dismounted, tethered his horse, and began to set his traps. The kind only old men know how to make. A few sticks of dynamite left from a forgotten war, a line of dry brush soaked in oil, and the patience of a man who had lived through too many sieges. When the first riders reached the narrow pass, the world exploded. Fire leapt into the sky, rocks tumbled, and confusion spread like wildfire. Elias's rifle cracked again and again, each shot finding its mark with eerie precision. The ambush was perfect, but it was only a momentary victory. The riders regrouped quickly. The sound of their gunfire ebbed through the cannons like thunder. Elias retreated higher into the rocks, firing, moving, reloading, his old hands steady as stone. He fought like a spirit of the land, unseen but ever present. For hours, he held them off, the battle twisting through the red dust and echoing cliffs. But even legends have limits. His ammunition ran low, his breath ragged, his body heavy from the years that had never stopped chasing him. Still, he did not stop. He could not. Behind him, miles away, the Apache were disappearing into the mountains. Because of him. That was enough. As the sun reached its zenith, a bullet grazed his shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Pain surged, but he forced himself upright, staggering toward a higher ledge. Below, the men were shouting. They wanted him alive. They wanted the holed outlaw, who had humiliated their employers. Elias found shelter in a cave above the ridge. He crouched low, bleeding, his back against the cold stone. From this high perch, he could see the whole valley below. A river of men and dust, endless and merciless. He reached for the hawk talisman around his neck and felt its warmth. The image of Naomi flashed through his mind. Her steady eyes, her calm courage, her words. Such a capable old cowboy deserves to pass on his genes. He had laughed inwardly at the time, but now the phrase carried weight. She hadn't meant bloodline alone. She had meant legacy. Spirit. The continuation of what could not be killed. As the riders advanced, he prepared for his final stand. He stacked his last few rounds beside him, and whispered a silent promise to the desert. That he would leave it as he had lived in it, unbroken. But fate intervened once again. Just as the riders began scaling the ridge, the sound of hooves thundered from the opposite canyon. The Apache had returned. Against Elias's orders. Naomi had led a band of warriors back through the ravine, their war cries slicing through the smoke. Arrows rained down from the cliffs, rifles cracked from above, and chaos erupted once more. The tide turned swiftly. Trapped between the canyon walls and the fury of two fronts, the mercenaries faltered. Some fled, others fell. The desert took its due. When the dust settled, Elias stood on the ridge, swaying but alive. Naomi climbed toward him, her face streaked with dirt and determination. She had refused to let him die alone. The sight of her filled him with something he hadn't felt in decades. Pride, and perhaps something even deeper, though he'd never dare name it. The Apache gathered their dead in silence that evening. The victory was theirs, but the cost was heavy. Elias sat by the fire, his arm bandaged, his breath shallow but steady. Around him, the warriors nodded with respect, no longer to an outsider, but to one of their own. The old cowboy had saved them twice. But the desert was not done with him yet. That night, as the fire burned low, and the canyon wind carried the scent of rain, Elias stared into the embers. He had spent a lifetime running from the world, from love, from purpose. Yet here, in this harsh and ancient place, he had found all three. Still, he knew storms don't end when the thunder fades. Far to the east, beyond the horizon, the railroad men would learn of this defeat. And men like that never let go. The next dawn would bring new decisions, new dangers, and perhaps the hardest choice of all. To stay and fight. Or to leave so that those he had saved could finally live in peace. The desert dawn broke cold and quiet after the storm of gunfire had passed. Smoke hung low over the canyon like a ghost that refused to leave. The Apache camp was silent except for the faint cries of mourning. The kind that came not from weakness, but from honor for the fallen. Every warrior knew that the desert demanded payment for survival, and it had claimed its due once more. Elias Kane sat apart from the others on a ridge overlooking the valley. His arm was bound tight, his breath heavy, but his eyes were still sharp as steel. He had survived battles that should have killed younger men, yet the weight pressing on his chest now was not from his wounds. It was from what he knew was coming. Below, Naomi walked among her people, comforting the widows and tending to the wounded. The tribe's respect for her had grown tenfold since the battle. She had defied the elders' orders, led her warriors back into the fight, and saved the life of the man who had saved them all. But behind her strength was worry. Worry for Elias. The old cowboy had become more than a savior to them. He was now a symbol, proof that courage did not die with age, and that honor could be found even in those who came from beyond their world. Yet, in his heart, Elias felt a pull he couldn't ignore. The same restlessness that had haunted him all his life began to stir again. He had given them everything he could, his skill, his blood, his years. But he also knew men like the railroad bosses. They would not stop with one defeat. They would return, stronger, crueler, and this time, they would not come for the land alone. They would come for revenge. That night, as the tribe gathered for their victory fire, Elias stood silently behind them, his face lost in shadow. The drums beat slow and steady, a song of remembrance echoing across the canyon. When the fire burned highest, Naeli stepped forward, raising the hawk talisman toward the sky. It gleamed in the firelight, the same talisman Elias had once worn as a symbol of their bond. Then, without a word, she placed it back around his neck. It was more than gratitude. It was trust, the kind that transcended blood or tribe. The next morning, Elias prepared his horse before sunrise. He moved quietly, not wanting to wake the camp. His rifle was slung low, his saddle worn from decades of travel. He carried little, only what a man needed when he didn't plan to return. He rode out toward the canyon's edge, where the desert opened wide and endless. But before he could vanish into the horizon, he heard movement behind him. Naeli stood there, her hair whipping in the wind, her eyes filled with something deeper than sorrow. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. The gratitude, the bond, and the unspoken truth that neither could change the course of fate. Elias nodded once, a gesture of respect, of farewell, of something close to love. Then he turned his horse toward the rising sun and rode out into the open plains. Days passed. The desert swallowed him once more, as if it had been waiting all along. He traveled through abandoned mining towns, ghostly rail tracks, and forgotten outposts, relics of a world being swallowed by the march of progress. In every shadow, he could feel the presence of pursuit. Scouts from the railroad men were searching for him, hungry for vengeance. But Elias Kane had made peace with the idea of death long ago. He no longer feared it. What mattered now was drawing the danger away from the people he had come to call his own. At night, he camped beneath the stars, the same stars he had lived under for half a century. The hawk talisman lay against his chest, warm and steady. In its weight, he found calm, a reminder of the tribe, of Naeli, of the life he had finally touched, even if only for a fleeting moment. He thought about the words she had once said, words that had echoed across the campfire. Such a capable old cowboy deserves to pass on his genes. He understood them differently now. She hadn't spoken of lineage, but of legacy. That his spirit should not die with him. That his strength should live on through those who had learned from him. The trail grew harsher as the days passed. His wounds reopened, and the fever came. Yet still, he rode, not away from life, but toward his final purpose. He knew what he was doing. The railroad men would find him soon, and when they did, he would make sure their vengeance died with him. By the 6th day, he reached the salt flats, a barren expanse of white dust and cracked earth stretching endlessly under the unforgiving sky. There, he made his stand. He built a small fire, positioned his rifle on the rocks, and waited. Hours later, the dust on the horizon began to rise. Riders approaching fast. The sound of hooves grew louder, echoing across the empty land. Elias Kane, the last of the great trail riders, stood tall one final time. When the first bullet whistled past his head, he didn't flinch. His rifle answered with deadly precision. Every shot counted, every motion deliberate. He fought not for himself, but for what he was leaving behind. For the Apache who had given him belonging, for the woman who had given him faith, and for the land that had been his only home. The battle was brutal and short. The desert once again drank deeply of blood. When the dust finally settled, the riders lay silent. Elias's rifle had fallen still. His body, slumped against the rocks, faced the sunset, as if watching the world he had defended one last time. In his hand, he still clutched the hawk talisman. The wind carried it from his fingers, lifting it into the open sky, where it glimmered in the dying light, before vanishing into the desert's endless horizon. Far away, in the Apache camp, Nellie stood on the ridge at that very hour. She felt the shift in the wind, the silence in her chest, and she knew. Legends didn't die quietly, they became part of the land itself. She raised her face to the sky, and whispered a prayer for the man who had changed her people's fate. The cowboy, who had fought like fire and lived like wind. The tribe would speak his name for generations to come. Not as an outsider, but as Old Hawk, the spirit who came from the plains to save them, and whose legacy lived on in every warrior who learned his way. The desert, silent and eternal, kept his story, not in books, not in monuments, but in the wind that never stopped moving. And in that wind, somewhere between the shifting sands and the whispering canyons, the legend of Elias Kane still rode. The wind over the desert plains carried a silence that felt older than time itself. Weeks had passed since the last gunfire echoed across the salt flats, yet the land still bore the scars of that final battle. The rocks were blackened with gunpowder, the sand still marked by hoofprints, and scattered among them lay fragments of the man who had become a legend. Elias Kane, the old cowboy who had ridden into the storm and never returned. Back in the Apache camp, life had begun to move again, though it carried a different rhythm now. The younger warriors trained harder, their eyes sharper, their spirits stronger. They carried his lessons in their every movement. Patience, precision, and above all, purpose. The tribe's hunting parties began to call themselves the Hawk Riders. Not out of superstition, but in memory of the man who had taught them how to fight like the wind, and see like the hawk. Nellie often walked alone to the ridge at sunset, the same place where she had last seen him ride away. The wind would rise at that hour, sweeping her hair back, whispering through the canyon in tones that seemed almost human. She had not cried for Elias. Not once. The Apache did not weep for warriors, they honored them by carrying their strength forward. But in her heart, she carried a quiet ache that words could never hold. The ache of knowing she had met her equal, only to lose him to the world he came from. The elders spoke of omens, of the hawk that now circled the camp each morning, never landing, only watching from afar. To them, it was a sign that the spirit of the old cowboy had become one with the land. To Nellie, it was a reminder that some souls could never be tamed or contained, not even by death. As the seasons changed, the railroad men did not return. Their defeat had spread fear among their ranks. Word of a lone cowboy who had taken down an entire company had become the stuff of campfire tales among frontiersmen and outlaws alike. Some said he had become a ghost, haunting the trails. Others said he had ridden into the mountains to start a new life. But the truth was simpler, and far more profound. Elias Kane had found what every wandering man seeks and rarely attains: peace. Months turned to years. The Apache village grew stronger, more prosperous. The younger generation, those who had once played in the dust, now stood as proud warriors. Many carried rifles fashioned in the old cowboy's style, their grips wrapped in the same rough leather he once used. The mark of the hawk became their symbol. Painted on shields, carved into totems, and burned into the hafts of their weapons. Nellie herself became a leader among her people. She guided with wisdom and fire, shaping her tribe's path not through fear, but through balance. The very lesson Elias had left behind. Though many suitors sought her hand, she chose none. Her life was bound to something greater than any union. It was bound to the memory of the man who had shown her that strength and compassion could live in the same heart. One cold morning, after a night of heavy rain, a group of young hunters returned to camp with a strange tale. They had found something half buried in the salt flats: a weathered rifle and a saddle. the leather cracked but still strong. Tied to the saddle horn was a small hawk feather, perfectly preserved despite the years. When Nayeli saw it, she did not speak. She simply took the feather and held it to her chest, her eyes glistening in the dawn light. That night, the tribe lit a great fire in the heart of the camp. Every man, woman, and child gathered around as the drums began to beat, slow and steady, echoing through the canyon walls. It was not a morning fire, but a fire of remembrance. They told his story, not as the tale of a white cowboy who came to their aid, but as one of their own. The old cowboy had not just saved them, he had changed them. His blood might not have mixed with theirs, but his spirit had. In their eyes, that was the truest inheritance of all. As the flames reached toward the stars, Nayeli stood at the edge of the firelight, the hawk feather in her hand. She lifted it high into the wind. The tribe fell silent as the feather caught the rising air, twisting upward, glowing in the fire's orange light, before vanishing into the dark sky. The moment stretched on, quiet, eternal, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. Some said that in that moment, they heard a faint sound, the distant rumble of hooves, echoing from the horizon. Others swore they saw a lone figure riding across the dunes under the moonlight, his hat low, his rifle slung, his horse steady and sure. But whether it was spirit or illusion mattered little. For the people who stood by that fire, it was a sign that the hawk still rode. Generations passed, but the legend endured. Travelers through that part of the desert still spoke of strange winds that guided them away from danger, of campfires that burned blue when outlaws drew near, of the faint glint of metal half buried in the sand, as though the land itself guarded something sacred. The Apache told those travelers that it was the spirit of a man who had come from nowhere, fought for honor, and never truly left. And so, the legend of Elias Kane, the old hawk, became part of the land's story. His name was etched not in stone, but in the memory of every soul who crossed those plains. He had been many things in life: a drifter, a gunfighter, a loner. But in the end, he had become something far greater, a bridge between two worlds, a symbol of courage, loyalty, and love that defied time. As the sun sank one final time behind the red cliffs, casting long golden light across the valley, the hawk returned once more, soaring high above the desert. It cried out sharp and fierce, before disappearing into the horizon, free, eternal, and unbound. Below, in the soft wind, a whisper seemed to linger, the voice of the desert itself, carrying the memory of a man who had lived by the gun, died by honor, and left behind a legacy that could never be buried. The world moved on, but the spirit of the Wild West, and the legend of the capable old cowboy, would ride forever.